this is a session entitled Writings on Regionalism. It addresses his two essays on regionalism, one published in 1992, one published in 1996. So coming more than a decade after the work on critical regionalism in the early 1980s. And our first speaker is Phillip Denny, who's a doctoral student at Harvard. He'll be followed by Levin, who teaches at UCLA, and our respondent from Zurich is Stanislaus von Moos, the Emeritus Professor at the University of Zurich. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Phillip.
Thank you, Kathleen. Before I begin, of course, I want to thank the organizers for putting on this wonderful colloquium and for inviting me. I'm, of course, honored to take part in this conversation. Can you see my slides okay? Now, in this brief presentation, I'll review the idea of regionalism in Colquhoun's scholarship, but I'll also lay out some ways in which the concept continues to inform architectural history. I'll simply begin by highlighting the role of regionalism in Colquhoun's historiography and its criticism. And later on, I'll offer a very short overview of regionalism's bearing on histories of modernist prefabrication in the context of empire and colonialism. I want to start with Colquhoun's Modern Architecture of 2002. This is a straightforward survey which follows a diachronic structure, each chapter advancing a coherent historical narrative. The book's scope is considerable, spanning from around 1890 to the tail end of the 20th century, but it also maintains a precise historical focus. Now, while the scholarship of recent decades has pluralized accounts of modern architecture, with historians authoring an abundance of new perspectives, critiques, and revisions to the well-known outlines of modernism, Colquhoun's ambitions with this book are of a different kind. It is rather an attempt to consolidate and investigate an idea of modern architecture as a singular international movement. To this end, Colquhoun ascribes to the many architects and branches of the modern movement a common conviction that architecture could recover the quote-unquote stylistic unity and organic relation between society and building characteristic of pre-industrial eras. But this is not to say that Colquhoun's account flattens or rather smooths over the wrinkles in the record of modernism. Rather, has been pointed out in the earlier panels, Colquhoun revels in the many ambiguities and contradictions of modernism. And indeed, here he observes something of a profound or even irreconcilable contradiction at the intellectual core of the modern movement, which in his words simultaneously encompassed resistance to social modernity and an enthusiastic acceptance of an open technological future. He continues here, noting that modern architecture longed for a world of territorial and social fixity, while at the same time embracing incompatibly an economy and technology in flux, end quote. In Colquhoun's account, this paradox would be something like the movement's fatal flaw, or as he once called it, modernism's Achilles heel. That is, modern architecture's theoretical program was hopelessly Janus-faced, caught between looking prospectively ahead to the unlimited potential of technology and looking backward romantically to supposedly authentic social forms long since rendered obsolete by industrial capitalism. You can think of the agrarian village, Gemeinschaft, and so on. But importantly, in Colquhoun's narrative, this opposition is adjudicated, but not to say resolved, in the category of the region and the concept of regionalism that is the topic of this panel. Now, it should be noted that regionalism played a number of roles in Colquhoun's work. For Colquhoun, the architect, regionalism gave a name to certain qualities of building, sometimes expressed as subtle responses to local conditions of site, considerations of materials, climate, and so on. Modern architectural regionalism in this sense was a critique of universal dispositions, a critique of construction untethered from historical and geographic context. At the same time, for Colquhoun, the historian and critic, surfacing regionalism as a significant ideological formation wound its way through the history of modernism. The concept introduced new complications in the dominant historical narrative, intensifying the polarities of the universal versus the particular, the global against the local. Of course, it should also be noted that Colquhoun's writings on regionalism represented just one moment and one viewpoint, albeit a significant one, in a consequential discourse in modern architecture. He addressed the theme directly in a series of essays published in Casabella and elsewhere between 1983 and 1996. Other contributions of note to the discussion of regionalism in the 1980s are better known, such as that of the architect and historian Kenneth Frampton, or the arguments for critical regionalism advanced by the architects Alexander Tsonis and Liane Lefebvre in their jointly authored 1981 essay, The Grid and the Pathway. They offer a useful definition, which I share here, which arrives just ahead of an argument for a theoretical program of critical regionalism. But already their definition marks regionalism as an ambiguous development, and perhaps to a degree, an ambivalent one. Ambiguous because the relations between universal factors and local features remain indeterminate or arbitrary. And ambivalent because, as they note, regionalism has historically appeared in association with political projects on either side of the divide, separating liberation and repression. Colquhoun addressed the political ambivalence of regionalism most pointedly in his essay, Regionalism 2, which appeared under the title Critique of Regionalism when it was published in Casabella in 1996. He's forthright on the intimate correspondence of regionalism and nationalism, writing, and I quote, "Regionalism owed much of its influence to the growing power of the centralized nation state. The relation between them was twofold. On the one hand, peoples whose cultural identity had been suppressed used the concept of the folk to legitimize claims to unification or independence. On the other hand, nation states themselves idealized their own folk traditions. Indeed, he argues that regionalism is in this sense inextricable from matters of modern statehood. And in this respect, the nation state plays a more prevalent or even determining role in Colquhoun's regionalism than in other formulations, which tend rather to refer to local, traditional, or quote unquote autochthonous cultures as if these were actually existing entities in the world, as if they were separable from conditions of political governance. Rather, as Colquhoun emphasizes repeatedly, cultures as such no longer exist, but states certainly do. And indeed, in this way, the history of regionalism, as narrated by Colquhoun, may well be the modern history of the nation state. In the essay Regionalism 1 of 1992, Colquhoun writes of 19th century projects of national identity formation, such as the unification of German Empire in 1871. He notes that, quote, representation of national essence was largely fictional, but it had a clear ideological function. That is, the legitimation of a nation state in terms of a regional culture. And in this, it was successful, end quote. This observation is significant for several reasons. First among which is that it suggests regionalism was not merely an adjustment or modulation of architectural design in light of extrinsic circumstances like topography, local traditions, or customs, but rather that it always involved the construction and projection of idealized regional cultures from without, and in parallel sometimes with large-scale political projects. Moreover, this understanding of regionalism's intellectual history is integral to Colquhoun's modern architecture. his historiography. It's particularly acute in his writing on the work of the architect Le Corbusier in the late 1920s as a member of the neo-syndicalist group in France. Colquhoun notes that the group's philosophy sought to alleviate the, quote, alienation of modern social life by promoting a return to so-called real man and a spirit of community. He thus associates syndicalism's program to recover authentic social forms with the architect's movement from a formal language of white cubic forms toward quasi-rustic works in masonry, inspired by unauthored French vernacular buildings. In Colquhoun's account, then, the political outlook of neo-syndicalism is inextricable from the regionally inspired aspect of Corbusier's work in this moment. But in Colquhoun's essays, regionalism is a contemporary topic of critique. And in this respect, Colquhoun puts it thus. He writes, given the radically changed circumstances of the modern world, does this cluster of concepts still make sense? In a sense, it's also our question today. But he writes and he argues that the old regionalism is no longer tractable because the geography of the modern world has been irrevocably transformed. Although real and imagined differences of topography, climate, custom once underwrote the identity of regions in an agrarian and pre-industrial world, he observes that such distinctions no longer hold. The region thus no longer pertains as a meaningful geographic entity. Rather, he writes, the nation state is the modern region, a region in which culture is coextensive with political power. In sum, the trajectory of modern regionalism from the Enlightenment to the close of the 20th century sees regionalism supplanted by a kind of proto-nationalism. And on this point, I do not think that Colquhoun is wrong, but it remains an open question whether a nationally inflected architecture can be anything more than a negative proposition, tending only toward restrictive and essentialist notions of cultural authenticity. And in that respect, this final transformation of regionalism still bears the hallmark of ambiguity. Now, to shift gears slightly, I want to ask how a sense of regionalism may inform the writing of architectural history today. So I'd like to briefly outline one possibility by way of example and schematically lay out how regionalism may challenge some canonical assumptions in the history of modern prefabrication. In this case, I'll refer to the contributions of Gilbert Herbert, a prolific historian whose writings on prefabrication remain fundamental to the subject. As it happens, my dissertation research deals with a case study from the 1984 book, Dream of the Factory-Made House, that is Walter Gropius's so-called Copper House project. Now, I invoke this case because it illustrates what I recognize as the properly territorial scale of modernist prefabrication. These copper-built structures were designed and fabricated in Germany, manufactured from copper ore mined in British Mandate Southwest Africa, exhibited in Paris during the Colonial International Exhibition of 1931, where incidentally they were awarded the grand prize for architectural design. And finally, these same houses were marketed for export and assembly in Palestine and elsewhere. As such, they traced the global political geography of their interwar period, and moreover, they circulated within the channels of colonial culture. So in this way, the houses themselves might be thought of as constitutive of a global geography of extraction landscapes, manufacturing centers, and territories of distribution. As such, the structures challenge and complicate our understanding of the prefabricated building's relations to site. And in fact, regionalism may prompt a reconsideration of prefabrication's assumedly universal regard for site and situation. Prefabricated buildings have been typically discussed in architectural histories as a variety of building with only an abstract notional relation to any eventual place. But in fact, prefabricated structures are more often designed to anticipate certain conditions of climate and use. And moreover, their production required intensive coordination among a host of dispersed sites and parties. This oversight in extant histories of prefabrication is problematically misleading because questions of geography and situation might in fact be nowhere more pivotal or considered more intensively. Indeed, rather than being entirely removed from questions of site, modernist prefabrication drew upon and was constitutive of a territorially scaled network of processes and places. This follows, of course, from the simple fact that materials always come from some place and go somewhere else. So in order for prefabrication to become a supposedly siteless construction technique, it required that geographic space be sufficiently uniform, such that materials and labor could be reliably coordinated across considerable distances. In this respect, regionalism thus complicates our understanding of the global territorial ambit of demountable prefabricated buildings. In some respects, the universal ambitions of modernist prefabrication would seem to be antithetical to a regionalist conception. Rather, regionalist ideals appeared even in instances in which imperial powers imported official architectural styles to the colonies by way of prefabrication, reflected in so many attempts to adapt national architectural idioms to the local climate. In this way, Herbert's treatment tends to de-emphasize prefabrication's unique condition of territorial dislocation, preferring instead to consolidate the design historical narrative of the copper houses in the person of Walter Gropius and his collaborators. Unfortunately, this has the effect of treating this exceptional architectural case as anything but. Rather, when thought through geography and regionalism, prefabrication apparently transforms the architectural object from a situated and singular construction to a circulating and multiplicitous commodity, a logic that is part and parcel with prefabrication's territoriality. Now, as I come to a conclusion, I want to note that recent interest in writing global histories of architecture provides an occasion to re-examine the role of regionalism in modern architecture at a high level. Global architectural history aims to, in part, apply a corrective to Eurocentric and Western biased categories. And in this respect, the legacies of regionalism are certainly due to be reevaluated. In the abridged example that I've given here, I suggest, or rather I begin to suggest, a shift in the typical connotations of regionalism somewhat, in a way that is intended to open the concept to varieties of analysis that are not confined by the terms prehistory. By this, I mean to devote comparatively less consideration to regionalism as the recovery or representation of essentialized and idealized regional or autochthonous cultures, while paying altogether more attention to actual transactions of materials and labors across territories. I believe that this slight but significant change in critical focus may lead toward a fuller and more worldly exploration of architecture's regionalism, one which is, after all, better suited to directly engaging the real ecological, economic, and political crises of the present day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that lovely, lovely talk. And now I'd like to welcome our second speaker, Professor Levin, to the podium, so to speak.
And I talk. Do you see the talk?
We do. We're still in the mode where we see everything on the side as well. So you might try to share. They're perfect.
Okay. Okay. So hello, everyone. And thank you, Mary and Irina, for organizing this fabulous event. And it is a pleasure and honor to take part in this multi-generational conversation. So it's a great model. As you can see, my talk today is called Regionalism, Character, and the Post-War Discourse on Climate. And again, as like others, I nod to the more senior faculty in the crowd who have specialized and written about character extensively. So I am, again, with this disclaimer in mind. So in the two short texts Alan Colquhoun published on regionalism, the first in the edited volume Post-Colonial Spaces in 1992, and the second in Casabella in 1996, he traced the use of regionalism in architecture criticism back to the 18th century, arguing that as a form of representation, it was associated with Romanticism and Historicism. He first established it as a category that countered and contested rationalism and classicism, only to show that the postulates underlying these forms of representation at times converged, and at times the distinctions between them collapsed. In this talk today, I would like to discuss the convergence and divergence of these two forms of representation by focusing the discussion on the discourse on climate in the post-war dissemination of architectural modernism in the Global South. But before we turn to climate, as one of the constant features of regionalism that persisted since the 18th century, I would like to recapitulate Colquhoun's critique of 20th century regionalist discourse, spanning from Le Corbusier's attempts to marry classicism, universal technology, and regional vernaculars to the concept of critical regionalism as coined by Alexander Tsonis and Liane Lefebvre in their 1981 essay. Regarding Le Corbusier, Colquhoun identified in his attempts to marry Mediterraneanism and classicism early in the 20th century a prelude to his claim in 1929 that regional traditions and vernacular practices could be reconciled with modern technology. According to Colquhoun, this claim, I quote, can be taken as more or less representative of a post-1930s architectural avant-garde that sought a modernism that would be determined simultaneously by modern technology and by the perennial architectural values inscribed in regional material and culture. Addressing Le Corbusier's two postulates, one, that modern architecture should be conditioned by universal technology, and two, modern architecture is or should be conditioned by local costumes, climate, etc., he argues that not only that the relations between the postulates remains a mystery, but that this assertion also ignores the possibility that universal technology, sorry, I don't have it, and local custom are intimately connected, so that a change in one necessarily produces a change in the other. This aspiration to marry the universal with the particular persisted throughout the post-war years, reaching in the 80s an apogee in Tsonis and Lefebvre's strategical employment of regionalism as a critical counterforce against global capitalism. Unlike Le Corbusier's aspiration to seamlessly marry universal technology with local customs, Tsonis and Lefebvre's critical regionalism derived from a recognition that the local and the global, or the particular and the universal, could not be harmoniously reconciled. In their proposition to consider the local through the technique of defamiliarization or estrangement, they rejected naive assumptions about cultural appropriation in efforts to keep situated modernisms within the critical tradition of the avant-garde, rather than succumbing to the logic of late capitalism and its postmodernist symbiotic trappings. Colquhoun did not spare his sharp criticism in regards to their stance too, arguing that Tsonis and Lefebvre's dual desire to preserve and resist by waging culture against civilization proves their impossibility. I quote, "It draws attention to the fact that the postulated organic world of regional artifacts no longer exists. Far from resisting the appropriations of rationalization, it confirms them by suggesting that all that remains of an original, unitary body of regional architecture are shards, fragments, bits, and pieces that have been torn from their original context. If attempting to recreate such wholeness will result in kitsch, the only other alternative is to leave us with irony, the impasse of postmodernism." For Colquhoun, ultimately, the architect cannot stand outside of the system of late capitalism, just like the region, however it is defined, does not stand outside of the forces of history. In a sober tone, he concludes, local customs do not disappear completely. They become reterritorialized. Virtual cultures of choice take the place of cultures born of economic necessity. Dubrovnik becomes Disney World. Within this pessimism, however, one can detect glimpses of possibility. These do not derive from deep-held continuities with past traditions and regional imaginaries, nor are they occluded by the doom of globalization that transforms every Dubrovnik to a Disney World. The real situation, I quote, is not one of cultural studies and fulfillment, but of indeterminacy and change, in which a complex interlocking global economy creates new forms out of old cultures as it goes along, forms whose precise and determinate nature cannot be foretold with any accuracy. So this also relates to the critic that Charles Davis described of the biotechnical determinism. It is this indeterminacy which I would like to dwell on by focusing on case studies in the high period of situated modernism, namely the post-war years, characterized by the decolonization of Asian and African states from British and French rule. As recent scholarship on post-colonialism and globalization shows, the 50s and 60s presented multiple forms of geopolitical and economic alliances before their foreclosure in the 80s, the moment that gave rise to critical regionalism. In other words, competing forms of international alliances, such as presented by the non-alignment movement and the socialist bloc, offered alternatives to Western cultural hegemony. In the time that I have left, I would like, following Colquhoun, to explore the range of possibilities this indeterminacy gave rise to, that I argue fall neither in the category of resistance nor postmodernist Disneyfication, by contrasting two approaches in modern architecture's adaptation to climate. One by the Hungarian emigre brothers Aladar and Viktor Olgay, who being based at Princeton University represent, for the sake of the argument, American hegemony, and the other by Israeli Bauhaus graduate Ari Sharon's work in Nigeria, representing a case of South-South transfer of expertise. Again, I qualify this statement. Israel positioned itself as a southern developing country in solidarity with other developing nations during that time. Framed less as a battle against universalizing tendencies and more as a response to a lack of infrastructure to support the mechanical devices of cooling that in the US would increasingly become a standard commodity, the problem of how to adjust modern architecture to the tropical climate dominated the discourse on building in the former colonies and superseded discussions on national distinctions. So importantly, the idea of a tropics as a region, as promoted, for example, here by Fry and Drew, superseded any national discussions on national representation, national identity. And that was not only true for the colonizers, but also to the colonized, who were using the language of their colonizers or former colonizers. To what extent can we call these attempts at situating modernism a regionalist architecture? And what options did they open in terms of the relationship between form, climate, and local culture? To answer these questions, I would like to center my discussion on one of the most important sites of passive climate control, the building facade, and what became its most prominent feature in mid-20th century, the brise soleil, which I here use as a synecdoche for a range of sun shading devices. In the double spread of the opening pages of US-based Hungarian emigre brother Viktor and Aladar Olgay, 1957 solar control and shading devices, we find the juxtaposition of two facades, both situated in Rio. On the left, a mid-century modernist curtain wall punctuated with vertical fins, and on the right, a Baroque building. Next to the images, an epitaph by Marcel reads, "The sun control device has to be on the outside of the building, an element of the facade, an element of architecture. And because this device is so important, a part of our open architecture, It may develop into a characteristic form as the Doric column. In this brief statement, Breuer displaced the sun shading device from the techno-scientific environmental discourse to recast it anew as a cultural achievement, compared no less to the epitome of classic architecture, the Doric column. Through this quote and the superimposition of Jacques-François Blondel's human profile on the facade of the Ministry of Health and Education in Rio, famous for its brise soleil, the Olliers recast the sun shading device as a new order, whose cultural significance far exceeding its technical application. At stake in this new order was a universalism based on geographical specificity, a reaffirmation of the universalism of modern architecture at a time when the international world order which gave rise to it was challenged by a new geopolitical reorganization. By superimposing Blondel's profile over the facade of the ministry in Rio, the Olliers invoked the 18th century concept of character, which I would like to argue, following Colquhoun, is intimately tied to the discourse on regionalism and the concepts of race it evokes. A capacious term that denotes the building's potential to communicate its purpose, character stood at the center of 18th century debates about the appropriate relationship between a building and its facade. Significantly, this relationship was based on a dual expressive capacity. One, between interiority and exteriority, and second, between the building and its environment. Character, therefore, stood for the proper mediation between people and their environment. While Blondel's list of characters was not based on a racial typology, but rather on the moods the building might evoke, the focus on facial features, proportions, and for others, the measures of the skull, was part of a racializing discourse that paved the way to scientific racism in the 19th century. Alongside physiognomy, geography and climate facilitated this convergence of the discourse on character and scientific racism. Quatremère de Quincy's definition of character was based on the relationship between people, type of dwelling, and climate. Such views led to ideas about national character in the 19th century, in which the relationship between people and their environment in some parts of the world was defined in terms of an ability to conquer the environment through an inner force or Kultur. In such views, and excuse me here for the gross simplification, the world was split between northern cultures who were able to become productive despite the conditions of their environment, and the southern cultures who passively succumbed to their environment's detrimental effects. So not everybody were subjected equally to climatic determinism. Unlike the classicist regionalism promoted by the Olliers and Breuer, Ali Sharon's design for the University of Ife in Nigeria defies both the brise soleil as a techno-scientific necessity and the Western metaphysical privileging of interiority as essence. Rejecting late colonial British architects Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew's tropical architecture approach that they epitomized in the neighboring University College Ibadan, and which was based on the colonial medical discourse on tropical disease and hygiene, as it pertained primarily to help colonial administration and soldiers to survive in what they perceived as hostile environments or from preventing them from going native, Sharon proposed instead the inverted pyramid, rendering the brise soleil an applied device akin to ornament. Other architects on this team would elaborate this design topology to maximize the possibilities of ventilation and hot air evaporation. So I trust that you can read this quickly because I'm going to move fast between the slides here. This building topology inverted the logic of filtering in Fry and Drew's partitions of air, which meant to conserve the energy of the Nigerian students. So on the right-hand side, you see the late colonial approach. Far from the passive conception of the student as a container of energy that requires conserving, the dynamic environment created in Sharon's team's designs not only increased ventilation and evaporation, but also the virility and freedom of movement of the students inhabiting the space. As I explained in depth elsewhere, although this typology did not have a close precedent in Israel, it derived from Aryeh Sharon's experience as a Zionist settler colonial pioneer in Palestine and the aspired healing of the Jews who were perceived as a degenerating race in Europe. According to Zionist thinkers, the regeneration of the Jewish body could only occur through its relocation and reacclimatization of the Jew to his native land, and a transformation through working of this land into a productive nation. In Nigeria, the empirical belonging of the black-skinned body, who doesn't require acclimatization, presented a substrate on which Sharon could rewrite the antagonistic relations of men and environment as constituted by British colonialism. With the removal of the brise soleil, the skin of the building was no longer perceived as a protective membrane, but as a plastic site for cultural inscriptions. To accentuate the wall's plasticity, Sharon used, in addition to murals and cutouts, corrugated grooving inspired by the UNESCO building in Paris. In his monograph, however, he cites the Yoruba, the dominant group in the area, famed bronze sculpture dating back to the 13th century as reference. My knee-jerk reaction to this reference was along Colquhoun's lines. I consider this borrowing as a decontextualized cultural appropriation, one that is meant to rationalize after the fact Sharon's design's decisions. Moreover, considering this as an ornamental feature, it seems to contradict Sharon's rejection of the brise soleil on account of its non-inherent relations with the building's mass. However, when considered as part of Sharon's approach to climate as a determining factor of regionalism and character, or the relationship between people, buildings, and the environment, I understand this rendering of the skin as more than a rhetorical gesture. In Yoruba culture, the grooving is reserved for the face or torso of Yoruba royalty and signifies their spiritual attributes. And here you have a different model of historicity with a king posing next to a non-linear lineage of those figurines representing royalty. Reminiscent of the practice of sacrification and tattoo, these bodily inscriptions thicken the skin as low relief and direct attention to its double function as a boundary and expression, what Anne Cheng identifies as skin's complicated relations to essence versus surface. As a vibrant and sensorial interface, the skin is the site where the spiritual is localized, pinned down to the individual and place, by the performance of inscription and the traces it leaves. By using this Yoruba tradition, Sharon reversed Western metaphysics privileging of depth over surface, or the hidden over the visible. And this is the logic of character, wherein the surface of the skin can indicate physical or moral degeneration. And embeds the building with African metaphysics that blurs the distinctions between culture and civilization. So even though Sharon drew this idea originally from UNESCO, he instructed the contractor to use local Yoruba builders, craftsmen, rather than the Israeli construction workers for the job, because he assumed an innate or a cultural tradition that can equally produce the results that he would have at UNESCO. Rather than dressing the modernist buildings up in Yoruba garb via superficial ornamentation and climatic protection, and these are images of how Fry and Drew's climatic protection also becomes in effect an ornament, Sharon rendered the modernist building skin itself Yoruba. If the 18th century discussion on character was meant to discipline facades by keeping them from becoming superfluous masks, Sharon used the modernist logic to critique the brise soleil as such a superfluous mask, while rendering the modernist wall thick enough to perform as yet another kind of mask. Unlike the brise soleil, Sharon's mask is integrated within the skin, just like the carving of Yoruba faces, indicating that there is no biology or essence underneath before the cultural symbolic, as the two are intrinsically linked. It is ironically the critique of the brise soleil as a universalizing mask, then, mediated by Sharon's Zionist settler colonial experience, that allowed him to endow man-environment relations with an idealized human face, albeit a black one this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm very, very grateful for that essay, that presentation. And here in Dublin, the Bainian bronzes have been much on our minds recently because we've agreed to give them back. So it's wonderful to see them in the relationship to architecture in Nigeria in this period. I'd like now to welcome Professor Stanislaus van Moos, who will be our final respondent of the day.
Okay, is there anything in particular that I have to do with my computer? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You have nothing more to do, just to speak.
Okay.
We're looking forward.
So, of course, I do have to do is to thank Mary and Irina for this incredible conference, this formidable display of the culture of the 20th century as seen by Alan Colquhoun, and as only very, very partly seen by myself. I had many meals with Alan, as a matter of fact, but very few saris in this connection. But not all of them, actually very few of them, turned about architecture. So in a certain sense, I really can't help myself from being deeply irritated by the idea that he might be somewhere realizing that I have accepted to take a role in this connection and speak as a respondent to a session that deals basically with thinking that he has articulated, for which he has led the way. So Alan, I deeply apologize. You have to talk with Mary and with Irina about this choice, and I'm totally irresponsible as far as that is concerned. The two of us were aware, I mean, I was aware that he made me aware every time I met him that I'm no thinker, that I'm no theorist, that I'm just a storyteller. And since there was a certain degree of overlapping areas, we had areas where we could seriously talk, but I could not seriously talk theory with him. And he could, of course, talk seriously history with me. So there was this fantastic, for me, fantastic, challenging kind of interactions with him, for which I now try to pay my debt by thanking these two extremely interesting, enlightening, visually rich and dense presentations on the subject of regionalism. Both are reminding me of the first among Colquhoun's various essays about regionalism and technology, 1983, so very early, 2 years only after the publication of Alex Tsonis and Liane Lefebvre's first venture into the idea of critical regionalism. And I do suspect that for both these presentations that we've heard, this particular essay is perhaps key in the view of the discussion of prefabrication, especially also in the case of Gropius, but also in the case of Sharon and the Olgies in the second presentation we've heard. Thank you also, especially Phillip Denny, for reminding us in passing of the fact that Colquhoun, for being a great historian, a formidable theoretician, was also a practicing architect, which is something that fortunately Tony Whittler has insistingly reminded us, and which brings me to confess that I can't avoid placing a little footnote to the first of the two presentations. In fact, while I was reading Denny's paper, and now while I was following his presentation, I wondered to what a degree Colquhoun's problem with the various species of regionalism, that is his reticence of seeing a clear-cut split between the worlds of global technology on the one hand and regional identity and authenticity on the other, may have been part of his thinking as a practicing architect. We have learned from Irina in her presentation to the symposium, and also in her introduction to the beautiful book that I have here on my table, The Colquhounery, that as a young architect, after making his diploma at the AEA, Alan decided to spend some time in an office in Switzerland, preferably in the office of Alfred Roth, whose book, published in 1940, he apparently admired. And I even read in Irina's book that he considered himself influenced more deeply by Alfred Roth's book, which I want to show you. I don't know if I managed to have the computer shared. Actually, I should probably open. Can you see it?
We
You've
can,
seen it already,
thank you.
you've seen it already briefly in Irina's presentation. To my surprise, I read this morning in Irina's introduction to her book that he was more influenced by Alfred Roth than he ever was by Rudy Witkover's principles of humanist, the architecture of humanism, and also of Le Corbusier's modular, which is something that surprises because the introduction to this book by Alfred Roth is in fact very, very short. The book, the introduction certainly doesn't speak about regionalism, yet does insist that the premises for an authentically modern architecture are better in some countries than they are in others, depending on the political organization of those countries and on the stage within the industrial development they have reached. Roth is no theoretician, certainly not, but then he claims that by virtues of the nature of their politics and by virtue of the degree of industrialization that the small democracies like Holland, Sweden, or Switzerland have reached, these countries offer particularly good premises for the flourishing of a pragmatic approach to modern architecture. You could say, from today's point of view, that's a truism, it's a platitude. But you could also say that the idea that there is something like an industrial regionalism, and that this industrial regionalism has something to do with the conditions given in certain nation states, which is the term that Colquhoun likes to use, that comes rather close to what Colquhoun will propose 40 years and Frampton. Anyway, since Roth had no job for him, Colquhoun ended up spending considerable time working for the firm Eschlimann and Baumgartner, whose work was repeatedly published in the magazine Werk, then run by Alfred Roth. Hence, there can be absolutely no doubt that it was Alfred Roth who directed him to this particular firm where he spent a few months working. Eschlimann and Baumgartner are architects best known for their social housing projects in Zurich and for the extreme awareness of the rather highly developed systems of semi-industrial timber construction, facade cladding and roofing then available in Switzerland, resulting in projects which superficially, I don't know if you can see it in this, here you see it better, which superficially may look like committed to the finity of Swiss Heimatstil, were it not that what is typically Swiss in the end is less the timber cladding or the shape of the gabled roof with its tiles, but indeed the highly sophisticated semi-industrial makeup of those buildings. Granted that the fixity of this industrial culture that you see reflected in these drawings is of course indeed extremely relative. I personally find it difficult to read, to even understand the technical drawings, and what is even worse is that of course I doubt that any worker on a contemporary Swiss construction site would be able to read those drawings. So much for the lack of finity of industrial culture, the lack of absoluteness and neutrality and standard nature of industrial culture in the network of regionalisms and universalisms that make up mid-20th century architecture. And of course, another question is to what degree this experience with Eschlimann and Baumgartner may have left its traces in the work of Colquhoun and Miller after 1968, which is an issue that I don't want to discuss. I leave it open. This is some of a typical Zurich housing compound designed by Eschlimann and Baumgartner. And this is, of course, Colquhoun and Miller. Of course, Eschlimann and Baumgartner are not included in Roth's Neue Architektur, not Neue Architektur, but modern architecture. They're certainly not part of the new construction. That is the focus of Roth's gossip, nor of organicism that he was interested in his project for the house of Madame de Montreau in Zurich, nor really, of course, of Heimatstil. But they're sort of part of a slow architecture that combines elements of all these tendencies. I mean, this is what I would say about Eschlimann and Baumgartner. And of course, perhaps in a similar way, you could also argue that Colquhoun and Miller's 20 years later, the work of Colquhoun and Miller 20 years later are sort of stepping back from the clear-cut polemical nature of the isms of their time, new brutalism, critical regionalism, socialist realism, etc., etc. So much for the straightforward and unsensational architecture that Tony Vidler was referring to as being typical for Alan Colquhoun as an architect, for his pure brutalism, his modest or non-rhetorical architecture that is indeed a variation on the subject of the shed rather than the duck. I realize that this is, of course, not really here we have some more of this Eschlimann and Baumgartner kind of straightforward and unsensational architecture. I realize that this was not really a response, but rather a footnote to Phillip Denny's paper. I apologize for that. Denny's paper has itself started off from Colquhoun's idea that regionalism today has become an impossible program, perhaps a futile utopia, but certainly a fascinating pathology for historians to analyze. An impossible program because there is hardly anything left in the modern world that can be defined as the cultural identity of a region. A pathology, since there's hardly any architecture in modernity that is not somehow inspired by the longing for some kind of cultural site specificity. Colquhoun as a critic and as a practitioner may have shared our sympathy with regionalism as utopia. As a historian or a theoretician, in turn, I suspect he was more interested in regionalism as a pathology. And in a certain sense, that's probably true for any historian, certainly also true for me. Now, as far as Ayala Levin's fascinating paper, I'll be a little shorter. Olgi's brothers and about Marcel Breuer. I was particularly fascinated to see her use the sunbreaker as a kind of a litmus test for these architects, thinking about climate and culture. Thank you once again for reminding us of the issue of climate as a key concern in regionalism. Thank you for reminding us once more how right Colquhoun was when he insisted that we should abandon static definitions of the global and the industrial as opposed to the local and the regional, since it is the very aspect of globalization that these worlds are intertwined and have probably been so ever since people began thinking about such issues. I've been particularly intrigued by the way you introduced the term character into the discussion, thus not only displacing the discussion of modernist buildings from the merely technical or functional or biotechnical to the cultural, but framing the cultural by ways of terminology that goes itself back to the 18th century. You mentioned Blondel, you mentioned Quatremer de Quincy. Tony Vidler has already referred to the certain abstinence on Colquhoun's side for these two protagonists of 18th century theory. A terminology that has not been fully exploited in the discussion of modernist architecture up to recently. I myself have learned a lot regarding character and composition in mid-20th century architecture from Carlos Eduardo Comas' studies of Lucia Costa and Le Corbusier. Incidentally, I saw in your images the name of Carlos Eduardo Costa referred to. I find his work extremely enlightening as far as these connections of mid-20th century architecture with 18th century theory is concerned. Of course, we can also think of Jacques Lucan and others who have looked into this complex interactions and contradictions between composition and character in 20th century architecture. Although probably neither Comas nor Lucan have pinpointed the way you did race as one of the aspects architects have been implying when trying to give character to their buildings, be it in a patronizing intention, as is certainly in the case that you showed, or in the intention of expressing their own racial selves. Very grateful for these images, which in a certain sense have brought back a subject that has been so evocatively discussed earlier this afternoon. For me, it was the afternoon. For you, it was perhaps the morning, by Charles Davis. The Olcay brothers, I'm sorry to say, are entirely new to me, and perhaps not only to me, since the monograph you referred to in your paper has not yet found the way to Zurich. It exists only in one copy, namely in the Ticino. Marcel Breuer instead is not entirely new, since I happen to live in a house co-designed by Breuer, which is probably not entirely visible from my background. And of course, the very name Breuer brings to mind a host of others who belong to the gang, belong to the same generation and culture, some of whom you mentioned, Maxwell Fry, Jane Drew in your paper, not so much in the presentation. And behind them, of course, some others like Siegfried Gideon, whose pronouncements in favor of the new regionalism soon after the new monumentality precede critical regionalism by something like 30 years, and I think would really urgently deserve a scrutiny and analysis that would be as precise and as intelligent as the one you have applied to Colquhoun and to Sonis, Lefebvre and Frampton. I've been also particularly fascinated by your comparison of Aryeh Sharon on the one hand, and Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew on the other, of Sharon's conception of the user of his building as an active subject of work and meaning, as opposed to Fry's conception of the user as a passive receiver of a service that is generously offered from above by the architect to his client or to his user. Fascinating and extremely promising what you have to say about the surface at the end of your talk. Beautifully illustrated the skin of buildings and the place where these, the skin of buildings as the place where the interface of type and character, including racial character, of course, occurs. Where I would perhaps be tempted to quarrel a bit, or at least raise a question, is when you comment on Colquhoun's phrase about Dubrovnik that is doomed to become Disney World. You seem to be associating Disney World with what you call the postmodernist semiotic trappings, which is certainly the way Sonis Lefebvre and possibly also Kenneth Frampton, we can ask him directly in a moment, would have had in mind. Whereas I believe the point for Colquhoun was that anything in the world of late capitalism is doomed to become Disney World. As much as Disney World, on the other hand, has become a prime agent in the world of architecture too, be it POMO, decon, neo-constructivist, etc. POMO is no more capitalist today than Frank Lloyd Wright or Herzog de Meuron, but that, of course, is another issue. The bourgeois world culture, in the bourgeois world, culture is always culture of choice, never a culture of economic necessity. I think that is one of the lessons that Alan Colquhoun has taught us, and it has been clarified to me, especially also by these two late contributions to this conference, and I'm deeply grateful for it. Are there questions? I think now, Kathleen, you have to take over. I see you smile. And
yes, I have to take over, and I think we really don't have time for questions. I think there are many interesting comments in the chat, which I would encourage everybody to read, but we should be having a 2-minute break now after those really thoughtful and very insightful comments. And I think in particular, exploring Colquhoun's own experience in Switzerland, a very rich contribution as well to this conference, for which I thank you very much. But I think I've been asked to say a 2-minute break, and then we'll hear Kenneth Frampton for yet more insights on the topic of regionalism, I'm sure, ahead of us. Thank you ever so much to to all three of our panelists, our two speakers and the respondent. I'm very grateful. Keep your questions in reserve for the discussion after the keynote. There'll be time then, I hope, to return to these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stanislaus. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. It was really,
Thank you.
All your points are right to the point, and I think the Disney World critic, I think you're right. This is what he meant, and I've been trying to find a way out of it.
Well, you're doing fine. You're doing fine. Fantastic. It was such a fantastic talk, and also so rich with imagery and suggestive insights on the basis of the comparisons you brought in. I think it was a fantastic presentation. Actually, I had brought this image for you, which is a comment on Blondel plus the facade of Ministry of Education. Corbusier himself, making the argument of human scale. Sorry for this, because I really shouldn't insist. I think he on the back of the picture, he says, this document shows the inhabitants' family volume. I mean, he sort of associates not the individual or the human type, but the family as a type, as a unit, for which then the Brise Soleil, which is the focus of your paper, has become the indicator or the index, which I find an interesting footnote that brings it back to some of the premises of the people that you have presented.
That's fascinating. Where does this appear, or is this in your private archive?
No, this appears in a publication that Marcel and myself have done some 10 years ago, or maybe 12 years ago, a comparative study of Chandigarh and Brasilia in a little booklet that came out at the University of Italian Switzerland in Madrid.